Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining our study today. It's a beautiful day out there, and I certainly hope you get the chance to enjoy some of the sunshine because we haven't seen it very much for a long time. So please enjoy that. And again, so thankful that you take the time to listen to this study when you can. So we are picking up in Judges chapter 8, and we're at verse 11. You can see on the screen here, there's just some very interesting words. Remember, Gideon had 300 men, and they routed, as you see in verse 10, 120,000 men, and they kept going after them. So verse 11, it says that they went up by the way to these nomadic people who dwelt in tents that were obviously part of this army that was coming against them. And it says they smote the host, for the host was secure. Of course, that sentence jumps out at me because um, just the way it's structured makes no sense. If the host was secure, how could they smote it or take advantage of them? So again, this is where the Hebrew gives us just a great insight to it. When we look at the words, kind of circling it here with my cursor as you're looking at the Bible Hub and the end of verse 11, it says that the army, while they were in their camp, felt secure. So that really sheds a whole different light on it, that they felt secure. They didn't expect that Gideon was going to be able to come at them because they were complacent. They felt secure. There's a whole story in there sometimes as we are maybe not as aware of situations around about us, and we feel we have we'll say a false sense of security as these armies did. So again, very cool little nuggets there. And we get to verse 12 that these two guys, Zebah and Zalmunna, fled. Gideon pursued after them, and the kings of Midian, um, Zebah and Zalmunna, and it says another King's English here, it discomfited all the hosts. Had to look that one up because that's just a really fun word. And so it says that when we look at the end of that, it's the word routed, and that makes a whole lot more sense. But the root of it is actually kind of neat. It says that it's to be terrified. So here's Gideon with 300 men coming in, and however God was working through them, created an essence of them being terrified. And I think that's just gives us a little more insight into this whole thing of what has happened. And we'll see that that comes into play a little bit later when they finish all the battle and the army. So, verse 13, this thing lasted all night long. Um, Gideon returned from battle before sunup, and they happened to find a young man from the city of Succoth and inquired of him. Again, this is very fun because inquire just sounds so formal, and it's really the word to interrogate. It's, they did their military interrogation of this guy until he gave them the information that he wanted, and he spilled the beans, told them, all the elders of the cities. Remember, these were the cities that rejected giving Gideon and his men some food and sustenance when they were after the battle had raged, and they came to them and say, "Hey, can you feed us? And we'll protect you, and all will be great." And they mocked him and said, "Who are you? You guys have no chance whatsoever." So now Gideon is coming back to get revenge. And of course, that mentions that in verse 15, um, that they didn't give them any bread. And remember, he had mentioned about taking the elders of the city through the thorns and the wilderness and the briars. And again, verse 16, as you look at this word, and it says, and he taught the men of Succoth. Um, this word taught is really not the way we would think of it today. It means that he taught them a lesson. He help them to understand and cause them to know that he was able to seek out vengeance upon them and do what he had promised when he came back. And verse 17 shows that also that he beat down the tower of Penuel and slew the men of that city. Something I just want to share with you is as we read the Bible and as we read about these conquests and 120,000 people being killed, and those of you that are in my Sunday morning class and we're going through the book of First Samuel, we see that David went to cities and slew every man, woman, child, um, everybody, let nobody get away. Um, it causes our hearts to just be a little repulsive at that, and it is a fascinating area of study. This is called moral injury, and I've been reading a book. I kind of came across it through some of my chaplain work. Um, that talks about moral injury. It is the basically the essence of how we fail, or how it's so challenging to process great losses of human life. Just recently on the news, seeing the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, and the, you know, 7,000 people who were killed, and the images that are being broadcast to us that just make our hearts break. And the war in Ukraine, and the devastation and the images that we are being shown. The other things that happen around our country, where people are being killed and beaten, and officers being killed, and people arrested and being beaten, killed, and all of it just starts to pile up on us and creates something within us called moral injury. It goes against us as Christians, as decent, even decent human beings. Um, of all of the devastation, it becomes too much to handle, and how we process it, and how we let it affect us. And it can even be so close to home that it's something in our own lives. Was talking to someone just yesterday that they had a friend who was going through much heartache of a loved one who is has cancer, and maybe not sure what the outcome's going to be. And then right after that, received a call that a relative passed away, and then they're in the midst of some other family situations that are causing them grief. And then their job is in a place where they're dealing with people who are having lots of suffering going on. And all of this, becomes a challenge for us to deal with. And so this whole arena of what's called moral injury, being able to process this and being able to realize, what has happened, and through the time immemorial, and what has happened in so many battles, and the depravity of man that causes some of these things to happen, and how we deal with it. So, if that interests you, I invite you to look up that book, and may help you through some of that. But we see it here with David, excuse me, with Gideon doing that, and so he starts questioning the people, and he said, "Well, when you were in Tabor, uh, what did you do?" And he started telling them that they slew people there that had a resemblance to Gideon. They were fair, they looked like them. And Gideon says in verse 19, "These were my brothers, the sons of my mother." And he says, "If you had saved them alive, I wouldn't slay you." And then it gets really even more disturbing in a way here. He tells his firstborn Jether to go up and slay these two kings. Well, we don't know how old he was, but obviously he was not well trained and hardened from the battle, and he couldn't draw the sword. He feared because he was but a youth. And of course, these two kings, verse 21, they were not afraid to die, but they wanted to die quickly. So he's saying, don't let this kid, torture us. You come and fall upon us. And so Gideon rose against them and killed them. And then this is interesting here in verse 21. It says, "He took away the ornaments that were on their camels' necks." I want to look at that verse here because it sheds the light on something quite interesting. About maybe who these people were and what their ancestry was. And so when we get down to the end of verse 21, you'll notice that this word is 7720, which talks about crescent ornaments. I found it very, very interesting to see that the symbol of Islam is a crescent moon. And here were these people that we'll find out later are somewhat um, termed as the enemy, and they were wearing these crescent moons on their necks and on their camels' necks. So again, we see this shaping up here for what is going to happen in history, even to our current day. So, verse 22. Um, these men of Israel came to Gideon and said, "We want you to rule over us." Remember, time of Judges is prior to the time of King Saul, but here we see some little insights that they've been thinking about a king for a long time already. They want Gideon to rule over them, and let your son rule over us and your grandson. Uh, Create a dynasty, and we want you, and we'll be happy. Gideon, for his strength inside, and because he feared God, said, "Oh, no way! I'm going to put a stop to this." He quickly dismisses this, and he said, "We're not doing this. We're not ruling over you. The Lord shall rule over you." And this is the word Yahweh, and shall rule over you. But then in 24 through the end here, it gets really weird. It gets bizarre. Gideon, after he says that the Lord shall rule over him, starts doing some things that seem very pagan, very not in the Bible. Not in the way that they should be serving God. And maybe it's just a little bit of insight to where they had the right desires, but the wrong actions. They really didn't know. They were kind of messed up in their theology and how to worship God. So he says, I'm going to ask you to, everybody would give me the earrings of the prey, for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. This stuck out to me because obviously we remember that Abraham had at least two prominent sons. He had more afterwards. One was Ishmael, and the other was Isaac. And Isaac became the promised seed and is the um, ancestor of the Jewish nation. But the Ishmaelites also were promised to have a great nation, and they are the Arabic nations in the Middle East today. And so the commentators, weren't really saying that all of these people were Ishmaelites, but they equated it to a nomadic type tribe, and something that seemed to distinguish them was that they had gold earrings. That you could tell that they were of this nomadic tribe because they had gold earrings. Now, we don't know what the customs were of that day, and how they dressed and so forth. And you see today that men wear earrings, and customs are very fluid. But here, for them to be able to identify these nomadic tribes because they wore earrings, you'd also have to then understand that the Israelites did not wear them, and that they were not identified in that way, and they could not be mistaken for the Ishmaelites, and they did not wear golden earrings. Um, so here Gideon is saying, take all these golden earrings out of all the people that you conquered, and the weight of them was 1,700 shekels of gold. Well, I had to do some math here and found that a shekel is 0.025 pounds of weight, and so 1,700 shekels comes out to about 42 and a half pounds of gold. And so, what is Gideon doing with this? And he spread a garment and he took them and he did it made an ephod in verse 27. This word ephod, as we've talked about in some previous lessons, is a very challenging word. We are very uncertain as to what this means. We see it in the tabernacle where the priest would put it on an ephod, which was a girdle around about him, made of different materials and embroidered or covered with different precious stones or precious metals. Well, if he put 42 and a half pounds of gold on his little belt here, that you're not walking around very much at all. So was this really that type of ephod, or was it a type of idol? Some commentators think it was a type of memorial stone or memorial image that they put up to commemorate the great battle that God had done, which in itself seems like a right way to do. But we see that verse 27, this was not a good thing. It became a snare to Gideon. It uses a very strong word, which is whoring. We're going to just look at that in the Hebrew real quick in verse 27 so you can get the full impact of what this word means. And it comes from the word to play the harlot, commit fornication, be a harlot. Again, very strong words of being unfaithful. And I think that's the main uh, desired intention of understanding here is that they were unfaithful to God in such a way that they became enjoined with this whatever it was, mysticism or religious effort that went around this ephod, and it became a snare to Gideon and his house. Well, normally you would think that would be, you know, direct violation of God's commandment and that um, judgment would come. But verse 28 says that they existed this way for 40 years. God did not send any marauding armies in, God didn't punish them. God uh, was very tolerant and merciful of this misdirection that they went in. But we'll see here that it leads to worse. Okay, so Jerubbabel went, built his own house. Gideon had 10 sons, had a concubine, created a son whose name was Avimelech, which is very interesting because it means my father is the king. So there's some thoughts, okay, did Gideon regret not being made king later on? Is this again someone who was thought he was of royal lineage? You'll see there's many Avimelechs in the Bible. There just means that my father is king. So it says that we really don't know, but there was some significance that this was put in here because we don't know anything. He had 70. That's like 70. That's he was had many wives, of course. And so only out of those 70, 69 are not mentioned, but one is named Avimelech. So again, there's a story there that we uh, don't have anymore. So it came to pass that he died in a good age, old age, was buried, and notice verse 33 again, so sad. Israel turned again from God and went and using the same word, whoring after Baalim. So, what was so different about the same word describing what they did to the ephod versus the same word describing what they did to Baalim? Only thing I can figure is that the ephod was at least directed towards God, even though it wasn't the right thing that God had intended, but it certainly set up a pathway where they could easily jump over and worship a false god and forget about the one true God. And so, again, very sad epithet as this chapter ends that the children of Israel remember not the Lord their God who had delivered them from their enemies, and verse 35 is intriguing. It says they didn't show kindness to the house of Gideon according to all the kindness that he had showed unto Israel. So somehow there was jealousy, there was persecution. They didn't treat him very nicely after Gideon passed away. And we're going to see that we had an up in the roller coaster ride of the book of Judges, and you can imagine it's going to be going down. And so stay tuned. Come back next week as we go into chapter 9 and take a look at that. So God bless all of you. Thanks again so much for being a part of this and look forward to seeing you next week. Bye bye.